The field was already moving before the sun fully broke the horizon, as if the ground itself had started to breathe in shallow, uneasy rhythms that no one could explain. A single messenger on horseback reached the ridge, looked down into the valley, and never spoke a word again, only turning back as though he had seen something that was not meant to be witnessed. What lay below would later be remembered as Agincourt, but at that moment, it was simply a vast, silent stretch of churned earth waiting for an outcome no one dared to name. And yet, what truly unfolded here was never recorded in full by any court historian, nor preserved in the royal accounts in the way most people assume. There are fragments, contradictions, and sealed gaps in the official chronicles that hint at something far more complex beneath the surface of this encounter. Something tied not just to battlefield tactics, but to hidden decisions made long before the first movement of troops ever began. In the days leading up to this moment, messengers moved between courts in absolute secrecy, carrying coded instructions that never entered public record, shaping the conditions of what would appear on the surface to be a straightforward confrontation between two armies. The truth, however, is that both sides had already been altered by forces outside the battlefield itself, influenced by political pressure, fragmented intelligence, and decisions made in chambers far removed from the mud and mist of northern France. When the first formations began to appear on the horizon, they did so under skies heavy with rain that turned the entire landscape into a shifting, unstable foundation, where every step forward risked becoming a struggle against the earth itself rather than an opposing force. The field narrowed perception, compressing distance and sound until commands were swallowed by the environment, and visibility became unreliable, forcing entire formations to rely on instinct rather than coordination. On both sides, there was a growing awareness that something about this engagement was different from previous encounters, not because of the size of the forces involved, but because of how quickly the situation was beginning to escape the boundaries of planned control. What was expected to unfold as a structured exchange of pressure and response was already dissolving into something less predictable, as if the terrain itself had absorbed the logic of command and replaced it with uncertainty. And yet, even before contact was made, there were moments where time seemed to slow, where individuals on both sides paused, not out of hesitation, but out of a brief recognition that what they were about to enter could not be reversed once it began. Far from the field, no one could see this shift taking place, and yet those closest to the front lines would later describe an unspoken understanding that the situation was no longer following any familiar pattern. It is within this fragile opening that the true nature of what happened at Agincourt begins to emerge, not as a single event, but as a sequence of unfolding pressures that would push everything present beyond the limits of expectation and into a reality few were prepared to comprehend. The sense of uncertainty that had begun forming in the valley did not remain confined to the ground where the armies were assembling, but instead extended outward into a wider network of decisions, messages, and silent calculations that had been developing for weeks before anyone arrived at the field itself. In the royal courts, far removed from the damp soil and shifting weather, envoys moved through corridors carrying sealed instructions that were never meant to be interpreted by more than a handful of advisors. And even those advisors often received only fragments of the full picture. What appeared on the surface to be a direct confrontation between two military forces was in reality the visible edge of a far larger structure of political pressure, regional alliances, and internal disagreements that have been building across Northern Europe. In the months leading up to this moment, intelligence reports traveled between territories describing movements, supply limitations, and shifting intentions, but much of this information was incomplete, delayed, or intentionally obscured to protect strategic advantage. Within one kingdom, rival factions debated the timing of engagement, with some arguing for immediate confrontation, while others warned that conditions on the ground were not yet favorable, creating a tension that slowed decision-making at the highest level. In another court, leaders struggled to maintain cohesion among regional nobles whose loyalty was divided between personal interest and broader obligation, resulting in a chain of command that was strong in appearance but fragile in execution. Even the simplest logistical details, such as movement routes and timing of deployment, were affected by this instability, leading to adjustments that were communicated in coded form rather than direct instruction. At the same time, the physical environment of northern France was undergoing subtle but decisive changes as persistent rainfall altered the terrain in ways that would have been difficult to fully anticipate from distant planning rooms. Roads that had once been passable for coordinated movement became increasingly unreliable, compressing the space available for maneuver and forcing reliance on narrower corridors of approach. This narrowing of options did not simply affect movement, but also influenced perception, as commanders on both sides began receiving reports that no longer aligned perfectly with observed conditions, creating a growing gap between expectation and reality. In this environment, even small misjudgments carried amplified consequences, not because of any single dramatic event, but because every layer of planning was being filtered through unstable information. Meanwhile, communication between forward elements and central command became slower and more fragmented, with messengers encountering delays that were rarely explained in official records, further increasing the distance between intention and execution. As the moment of direct engagement approached, both sides were operating within systems that had already begun to diverge from their original design, shaped by incomplete intelligence, environmental resistance, and internal uncertainty. It was within this accumulation of unseen pressures that the unfolding situation began to take its final form, not as a single decisive plan, but as the convergence of multiple strange systems approaching their limit at the same time. As the layers of uncertainty continued to accumulate, the situation on the field began to develop its own internal logic, independent of the original expectations set in distant planning chambers. What had once been conceived as a controlled engagement between organized forces was now being shaped by conditions that no single authority could fully regulate. The communication lines that connected forward positions to command structures were functioning, but only in fragments, producing a delayed and incomplete understanding of how rapidly the environment was shifting. In the absence of reliable synchronization, each side began interpreting the same unfolding conditions through slightly different assumptions, creating parallel versions of reality that only converged in brief and unstable moments. Within this gap, decisions were made that relied less on complete information and more on adaptation to immediate surroundings, where visibility, terrain resistance, and timing became more influential than strategic intent alone. The landscape itself continued to exert pressure on movement, with saturated ground limiting coordination and reducing the effectiveness of carefully planned formations. Every attempt to maintain structured alignment encountered resistance, not from an opposing force in a direct sense, but from the cumulative difficulty of operating within an environment that was no longer neutral. This environmental constraint gradually influenced the rhythm of movement, causing pauses, compressions, and adjustments that were not originally anticipated in formal planning documents. At the same time, psychological strain began to emerge among those present, not as a sudden reaction, but as a slow accumulation of tension created by prolonged uncertainty and the inability to fully interpret the scale of what was developing. Individuals at various levels of command reported a growing sense that the situation was evolving faster than available information could be processed, leading to hesitation in some areas and overcorrection in others. This imbalance further contributed to the fragmentation of coordination, as small delays in response created larger divergences in positioning over time. In certain sectors, attempts to re-establish order through revised instructions were only partially effective, as those instructions often arrived after conditions had already changed again. The result was a continuous cycle in which perception and reality remained slightly out of alignment, never fully matching for more than brief intervals. Meanwhile, the original assumptions that had guided initial planning began to lose relevance as the situation progressed, replaced by a more fluid and unstable set of operational realities that demanded constant adjustment. Even as this unfolded, there remained an underlying expectation among decision-makers that the engagement would eventually settle into a recognizable pattern, though there was little evidence to support this assumption at the moment. Instead, each passing interval introduced additional complexity, further distancing the unfolding events from the structured models that had been used to anticipate them. It was within this expanding divergence between expectation and reality that the conditions continued to tighten, moving steadily toward a point where interpretation itself would become as critical as action. As the environment continued to tighten its influence over every aspect of movement and perception, the situation began to shift from instability into a state of constrained inevitability, where every available option carried increasing cost in time, coordination, and clarity. The systems responsible for maintaining coherence across the field were still functioning, but their effectiveness had become uneven, with some sectors maintaining partial alignment, while others drifted further into localized interpretation. This unevenness created a fragmented operational landscape, in which no single perspective could fully account for the entirety of unfolding conditions. Reports arriving from forward positions often describe similar phenomena, yet the timing and context of those reports varied enough to prevent a unified picture from forming at higher levels of command. As a result, decision-making became increasingly reactive, shaped more by immediate observation than by consolidated planning. In several instances, revised instructions were issued in response to rapidly changing conditions, but the delay inherent in transmission meant that by the time these instructions reached their destination, the circumstances they were meant to address had already evolved into a new configuration. This continuous lag between intention and execution introduced a structural instability into the coordination process, where each corrective measure risked becoming misaligned with the situation it was designed to stabilize. At the same time, the physical environment continued to impose its own constraints, with the ground conditions affecting movement efficiency and limiting the reliability of coordinated timing between different elements operating across the same space. These environmental factors did not act as a single decisive force, but rather as a persistent layer of resistance that compounded every attempt at organized maneuvering. Within this context, the psychological dimension of the situation began to play an increasingly significant role, as individuals at multiple levels of responsibility attempted to reconcile the difference between expected outcomes and observed reality. The growing gap between these two states produced a form of cognitive strain that influenced interpretation, leading to varying degrees of hesitation, acceleration, or recalibration depending on the position and responsibility of those involved. In some cases, attempts to restore coherence through stricter procedural control only intensified the fragmentation, as rigid structures struggled to adapt to conditions that were continuously shifting outside their original parameters. Meanwhile, the assumption that the situation would eventually stabilize into a predictable pattern persisted in certain planning circles, even as the evidence on the ground suggested a progressively less structured trajectory. This persistence of expectation, despite contradictory indicators, contributed to a delay in recognizing the full extent of the systemic divergence that was occurring. As time progressed, the interaction between delayed communication, environmental resistance, and interpretive variation created a layered complexity that no single corrective action could fully resolve. Each new adjustment introduced additional variables into an already unstable configuration, further increasing the distance between intended control and actual outcome. It was within this escalating divergence that the situation began to approach a critical threshold, where the accumulation of minor inconsistencies had the potential to redefine the entire operational framework. As the situation continued to evolve under the combined pressure of fragmented communication, environmental resistance, and increasingly delayed interpretation, a new phase of instability began to emerge that was not immediately visible in the external movement of forces, but instead developed within the structure of coordination itself. The system responsible for maintaining operational coherence was now operating under conditions where its internal feedback loops were no longer synchronized, meaning that information arriving at different levels of command often reflected different moments in time rather than a shared present reality. This created a condition in which decision-making was not only reactive but also temporally misaligned, as responses were being formulated based on inputs that no longer accurately represented current conditions. Within this environment, the distinction between planning and execution began to blur, as both processes were being influenced by the same delays and distortions in transmission. The result was a gradual erosion of confidence in centralized interpretation, leading to increased reliance on localized assessment, where individuals and smaller units were forced to evaluate conditions based on immediate sensory input rather than broader strategic context. This shift, while necessary under the circumstances, introduced further variability into the system, as localized interpretations naturally diverged depending on position, visibility, and timing. At the same time, the physical environment continued to function as an amplifying factor, reinforcing these divergences by limiting the consistency of movement and reducing the reliability of coordinated action across wider distances. As each segment of the system adapted independently to its own conditions, the overall structure began to resemble a collection of partially connected responses rather than a unified operational framework. In parallel, the accumulation of unresolved discrepancies between expected outcomes and observed reality continued to influence cognitive processing at multiple levels, creating a persistent tension between assumed structure and actual behavior of the unfolding situation. This tension did not manifest as a single identifiable moment, but rather as a continuous background condition that shaped every subsequent interpretation and adjustment. In some cases, attempts were made to reassert coherence through revised directives and recalibrated expectations. Yet these efforts were constrained by the same limitations that had produced the fragmentation in the first place. As a result, each corrective measure carried the potential to introduce new misalignments, further complicating the already unstable configuration. The system as a whole remained active, responsive, and adaptive, but it was no longer operating within a stable interpretive framework, meaning that its outputs increasingly reflected adaptation to uncertainty rather than control over it. Within this expanding divergence, the threshold between structured planning and emergent behavior continued to narrow, suggesting that the unfolding situation was approaching a state where traditional models of prediction and coordination would no longer be sufficient to describe its progression. As the structural instability within the operational environment deepened, the system entered a phase where adaptation itself became the dominant function, replacing any remaining expectation of stable control or predictable progression. Information continued to flow through existing channels, but its value diminished as the time gap between observation and interpretation widened beyond functional limits. In this condition, each incoming report was no longer a reflection of the present state, but rather a delayed snapshot of a situation that had already shifted into a different configuration by the time it was processed. This created a persistent mismatch between awareness and reality, where decision-making increasingly relied on inferred conditions rather than verified observation. Within this environment, the distinction between central coordination and local autonomy continued to erode, as smaller operational elements adjusted independently in response to immediate constraints, while higher levels attempted to maintain coherence through increasingly generalized directives. These directives, however, were constrained by their inability to account for rapidly diverging local conditions, resulting in a widening gap between intended alignment and actual execution. The physical environment continued to reinforce this divergence, not through a single decisive factor, but through a continuous series of minor resistances that collectively altered timing, movement efficiency, and spatial coordination. As a result, even routine adjustments required disproportionate effort to maintain partial consistency across different sectors. At the same time, the accumulation of unresolved discrepancies in interpretation began to influence the internal logic of decision-making, as assumptions that had previously been considered stable were gradually replaced by conditional reasoning based on incomplete and shifting inputs. This transition marked a significant shift in operational behavior, where certainty was no longer the foundation of planning, but rather a variable subject to constant revision. In several instances, attempts to restore structured alignment were implemented through revised frameworks of communication and control. Yet these efforts encountered the same fundamental limitation: the inability to synchronize across a system where each component was operating on slightly different informational timelines. Consequently, every corrective action introduced new layers of complexity, further increasing the distance between intended outcomes and observed results. Despite this, the system did not collapse into inactivity. Instead, it continued to function in a state of controlled instability, where responsiveness was maintained, but coherence was progressively reduced. Within this evolving condition, the threshold between organized structure and emergent behavior became increasingly indistinct, suggesting that the situation had transitioned into a phase where traditional models of coordination could no longer fully account for its dynamics, and where understanding itself required adaptation to uncertainty rather than reliance on fixed interpretation. Within the continuing evolution of the operational environment, a new layer of complexity emerged that was not defined by structural failure or sudden disruption, but rather by the gradual transformation of perception into the primary mechanism of control. As communication delays persisted and environmental resistance continued to influence movement, the system began to rely increasingly on interpretive behavior rather than direct coordination. This shift meant that the perception of conditions often carried as much weight as the conditions themselves, creating a dynamic in which belief about the state of the field began to influence decisions as strongly as verified information. In this context, the boundary between observation and assumption became increasingly difficult to maintain, as both were processed through the same delayed informational channels. The result was a system in which interpretation acted as a substitute for certainty, and where adaptation depended not on complete understanding, but on partial and continuously revised inference. As this process intensified, the internal coherence of decision-making began to fragment further, not through sudden breakdown, but through the accumulation of small inconsistencies in judgment and timing. Each operational element continued to function according to its immediate understanding of conditions, yet those understandings were no longer synchronized across the wider structure. This produced a pattern of parallel adaptation, where multiple localized responses coexisted without fully aligning into a unified framework. Within this environment, attempts to restore centralized coherence were increasingly limited by the same constraints that had generated the fragmentation in the first place, resulting in directives that were interpreted differently depending on their point of reception. At the same time, environmental factors continued to exert steady pressure on the system, reinforcing divergence by altering the reliability of movement, timing, and spatial coordination in ways that could not be fully standardized across all sectors. As a consequence, even when similar instructions were issued across different regions, the outcomes varied in execution due to differences in local conditions and interpretation delays. Over time, this variability became embedded within the operational structure itself, transforming inconsistency from an anomaly into a defining characteristic of system behavior. Despite this, the system remained active and responsive, continuously adjusting to incoming information and recalibrating expectations in real time. However, these adjustments were no longer guided by a stable reference framework, but rather by an evolving set of conditional responses shaped by immediate necessity. In this state, coherence was no longer maintained through alignment, but through continuous adaptation to divergence, where each adjustment served to stabilize only a portion of the system, while simultaneously contributing to broader fragmentation. As the process continued, it became increasingly evident that the traditional relationship between planning and execution had fundamentally shifted, entering a phase where understanding the present required reconstructing it from incomplete and shifting fragments, rather than relying on a unified and stable perspective. At this stage, the operational environment had transitioned into a condition where stability was no longer defined by uniform control, but by the ability of the system to continuously absorb and redistribute inconsistency without reaching total breakdown. The fragmented structure that had developed over time now functioned as a self-sustaining network of partial coordination, where each segment operated with a degree of autonomy, while still attempting to remain loosely connected to a broader framework of intent. This configuration did not restore clarity or centralized coherence, but it did allow the system to persist in a form that could still respond to changing conditions, even if those responses were no longer fully aligned across all levels. Within this environment, the concept of a unified operational picture had effectively dissolved, replaced by a mosaic of overlapping interpretations that shifted depending on position, timing, and access to delayed information. Each interpretation was internally consistent at the local level, yet incompatible when compared across the wider structure, producing a condition where multiple realities coexisted without a single authoritative version of events. As this condition stabilized into its own pattern, the system began to rely on continuous recalibration as its primary mechanism of function, adjusting expectations in real time to match incoming signals that were themselves already outdated by the time they were processed. This created a recursive loop in which understanding was always slightly behind occurrence, and action was always based on reconstructed versions of what had already changed. Despite this limitation, operational activity continued, sustained not by precision, but by adaptability under uncertainty. In several regions of the system, efforts were made to re-establish a shared framework of interpretation, but these efforts encountered the same structural constraints that had produced the fragmentation in the first place, resulting in partial alignment that decayed almost immediately upon formation. Environmental conditions continued to reinforce this instability by introducing persistent variability into movement and timing, ensuring that even closely coordinated elements experienced slightly different operational realities. Over time, this divergence became normalized, embedded into the functioning logic of the system itself, where inconsistency was no longer treated as deviation, but as expected behavior. In this state, coordination was redefined not as synchronization, but as the management of differences between asynchronous components operating under shared but incomplete intent. The system, though increasingly fragmented in structure, maintained a form of continuity through constant adaptation, where survival depended less on unified control and more on the ability to function within an ever-shifting landscape of partial information and unresolved interpretation. By the time the system had fully entered its final phase of operation, the distinction between structure and instability had ceased to function as a meaningful separation, replaced instead by a continuous state in which both conditions existed simultaneously without contradiction. What had once been interpreted as fragmentation was now the default architecture of the entire environment, where every component operated through partial awareness and delayed synchronization. In this condition, the system no longer attempted to restore a singular unified perspective, as the accumulated evidence had made it clear that such a perspective was no longer attainable within the existing constraints. Instead, continuity was maintained through perpetual adjustment, where each segment of the system recalibrated itself in response to shifting local conditions, while remaining loosely aligned with an overarching but increasingly abstract intent. Communication channels still functioned, but their outputs were no longer treated as definitive statements of reality. Rather, they were interpreted as time-shifted indicators that required contextual reconstruction before any meaningful action could be derived. Over time, this process of reconstruction became the dominant operational activity, replacing direct coordination with continuous interpretation of incomplete signals. Within this framework, the idea of a single defining moment became increasingly difficult to isolate, as every perceived transition was later revealed to be part of a longer sequence of gradual adjustments that only appeared sudden when viewed from a limited perspective. Even the concept of resolution lost its traditional meaning, as no clear endpoint emerged where stability could be said to have been fully restored or conclusively lost. Instead, what remained was a persistent system of adaptive behavior operating within an environment that continued to resist final categorization. In this extended condition, memory and perception began to merge in function, as both were required to reconstruct a coherent understanding of events that could no longer be observed in real time. Each attempt to establish clarity introduced additional layers of interpretation, further distancing understanding from any fixed reference point. The result was not collapse in a conventional sense, but a sustained existence within unresolved complexity, where the absence of a definitive conclusion became itself a defining characteristic of the system. Even as activity continued and responses were generated across all levels of operation, there remained an underlying uncertainty that no amount of adjustment could fully eliminate, as if the system had entered a state where every answer only revealed additional questions embedded within the structure of perception itself. In the end, what remained was not a completed event, but a continuing condition, one that could be observed but never fully contained, leaving behind a sense of unresolved presence that persisted beyond the limits of explanation.